Good day. This is the 11th in this series. While watching this video, if you find yourself feeling lost soon, it's a problem, but it could be a correctable problem. What I'm trying to say is, hands down, the best way to go? Start with the first of this series. Start with a woman with 1.5 hands, then proceed from there. Chronologically. You'll see. Anyway, here's part 11, or weeding out the Fripperies. As noted in part 10, Professor Durkheim mentioned on pages 306 and 322 of his book entitled Suicide, how the vast majority of us aren't suicidal and simply will not be talked into it by a ringleader or even a few ringleaders. That said, he spent most of his book's 405 pages showing time and again how, despite suicide's reputation for, or appearance of, being a highly individual and personal phenomenon, and as such, its study and prevention might, at first blush, seem to be the bailiwick of psychologists, this ultimate action is, contrary to that blush, demonstratively more explicable through the social structure and its ramifying functions. In the late 19th century, and to many in the more established field of psychology, these words did not compute. Quote, "Indeed, it is written in Suicide on page 20, some of those in psychology would have it that the fundamental patterns of behavior set in infancy are not seriously affected by social factors at all, and that neuroses are not cured by social analysis. This view seems to rest on the postulate that since therapy is and must be individual, and mental illness relates back to the evolution of the psyche, that, therefore, there are no social causes ascribable to individual cases." End quote. Translated, "If it can't be fixed on our couch," said one typical psychologist, ogling his cash register, "then it's either not a problem or not a fixable problem." In 1918, and at a symposium on suicide 2 decades after Durkheim published the primer on this topic, Freud, when asked whether psychoanalysis is helping or can help solve the suicide problem, concluded that the jury was still out, and that those in his field should refrain from forming opinions and wait till experience had provided more answers. And that's found on page 21. It would seem then that what motivated Durkheim to pursue this line of research, European suicide tripling between the 1820s and the 1880s, and this after having remained fairly stagnant from about 1500 until 1820, had still not been thoroughly explored, let alone answered or solved, and a symposium was organized to try to get to the bottom of it. Which begs the question, is suicide a mental illness or a neurosis? Or rather, is suicide a symptom of someone who was mentally ill or neurotic? Here Durkheim posits that since 80% of suicides are by men, and 55% of the patients at mental institutes are women, that if a causal connection existed between suicide and mental illness, that either more women would commit suicide or more men would be shuffling about in asylums. While employing a similar deductive style, Durkheim ruled out, one by one, a medium-length list of other variables that might have shown links or causal arrows between suicide rates and insanity rates, but instead proved to be inconclusive. Now, I could turn this into a book report, which is to say, I could delineate many more specific statistical analyses from this section of Durkheim's book, but for our purposes, it suffices to state that he wound up that chapter by showing that since the sane and the insane off themselves at approximately the same rates, there probably isn't a connection between insanity and suicide. This series would involve many more hours of reading or listening if I included here even a quarter of the fascinating moments in Suicide where its author compared the contents of one petri dish to another, so to speak, and then made deductions that with increasingly refined logic guided the reader toward his conclusions. If I seem to gloss over or skip ahead, it's not due to cherry-picking from his book a skimpy number of specific examples, and it's because of laziness or my purposefully avoiding examples that run counter to my comparison, but rather because I feel it's my job in these videos to show enough areas of similar deductive reasoning while keeping it short and sweet, and while lining up Durkheim's conclusions with an eye toward applicability to rape prevention. But please, be suspicious. Read his book. Your helpful comments, especially ones that make me out to be a shirker or a slacker, will be highlighted in the comments section, and maybe even addressed in a future video. Much like not all principles peculiar to Alcoholics Anonymous are transferable to, say, Sexaholics Anonymous, and if they were, we'd go extinct within 100 years or so, unless someone fell off the wagon. Yes, much in that same way, not all principles contained in the book Suicide are transferable to our topic. Hence, it's my goal to weed out the fripperies and condense that which is necessary and applicable. If I were to race ahead, which is to say, if I abbreviate too much, that would probably have the same results as skipping straight away to Durkheim's conclusions. In other words, most likely it would be counterproductive to skip a step or two, because then a viewer might still cling to the notion that suicide is strictly an individualistic action, and not see Durkheim's logical progression away from that and toward understanding that most suicides are due to susceptible people hearing it from too many ringleaders and for too long, and finally, they cave. Well, or some of them cave, and more of them cave under certain conditions than under other conditions. Durkheim spends most of his efforts searching and weighing and comparing, filling up petri dish after petri dish with variables like age, marital status, height, race, religion, nationality, season, various economic indicators, education level, whether one is urban or rural, has kids or is sans kids, and many, many more, all the while trying to narrow it down to what exactly is the perfect arrangement of social or environmental conditions associated with the lowest suicide rates going, and what are the worst conditions, the conditions associated with the highest suicide rates. If one likened the worst to a puddle of gasoline and the best to a puddle of water, what would happen if a spark suddenly materialized? Yes, often, very often in fact, there is a spark. There is a catalytic event that immediately or contemporaneously precedes this or that suicide, like a loved one dies, or the loss of a job, or a treasured stock plummets. Durkheim showed, however, that even though these sparks eventually make victims of us all, provided we live long enough, almost all of us never do ignite or combust, because the overwhelming majority of us are standing in the equivalent of puddles of water. Others, though, yep, gasoline. And there's always enough oxygen handy, which, for this analogy, would be the proverbial rope or tall building or snifter of Drano. Point being, Durkheim differentiated between motives and causes. The immediate motive or spark, allegedly being, say, the death of a relative or spouse, and the cause being the cumulative effects of a lifetime of alterable social conditions. Since oxygen's always around, and sparks touch all our lives often enough, the key difference between, and perhaps the only factor that can be changed regarding, these two petri dishes is that one contains gas, the other water. Let's study the differences between gas and water, said Durkheim. Maybe then can we lower the suicide rate. Now hold on a minute. A lifetime of alterable social conditions? What's that all about? Yes, eventually that's where Durkheim, a sociologist, landed. First, though, he ruled out environmental factors, or what he called cosmic influences. Here, he again received help from those in psychology, pivoting away from the sanitariums and turning his attention toward the so-called sane. Suicide rates skyrocketing because of weather or season? Sure, the psychological state or condition known as depression, that kind of depression goes up in the winter months. But suicide actually ebbs in December, January, gradually increasing until it peaks in June, July. Then it falls until it bottoms out again around the end of the year. And these stats remain very consistent year after year throughout Europe. Okay, but what if one is afflicted by a personal economic depression? Not the psychological kind, but the financial economic kind of depression. And as air conditioning hadn't been invented yet, that would make winter the more expensive time of year when one had to pay for heating. What then? Again, suicide is at its highest when commerce and agriculture are peaking in the late spring, early summer, but lowest when it's the hardest time to find a job, after harvest in the winter. Move south from Germany to Italy, i.e. go where it's warmer. Will that lower suicide rates? If you're Catholic, your rates stay the same. But keep moving. Move back north to Spain, Portugal, or Ireland, and they actually go down. Or stay in Italy, be there around the time when Rome was sacked in 1870, and notice how that when the capital of that nation was moved, and the economic, cultural, and artistic activities moved with the capital, that the suicide rate shortly thereafter changed to reflect that it followed to where the capital had been rebuilt. Italian weather patterns never changed during this suicidal shift. Could it be genetic? Do progeny commit suicide because their ancestors did? Probably not, wrote Durkheim, because there must be a social component involved, or why would so often the younger or ensuing victim choose the same device or style of self-killing? Junior heard around the dinner table that Uncle Boris used a rope, and, way more often than chance would have it, Junior just happens to also use a rope. If it were genetic, the methods of suicide would be more varied. Also genetic. Yes, children commit suicide, but at about the lowest frequencies there are. If suicide were hereditary, argued Durkheim, like tuberculosis or, say, the propensity to sprout facial hair, then either it would show up right after birth and in greater numbers, like TB does, or it would hold off completely until adulthood, like beards do. Gotta interject my opinion here, and that is, I'm sure Durkheim wasn't referring to infants killing themselves, because they couldn't. Anyway, that only a few of us commit suicide as children points toward a social factor. Very few of us get it when we've been snubbed with a sneer when we're young. But as we age, as we become more socialized to what these cues are, we begin to understand the snide look and what it entails. We begin to realize that that was a paper cut, and someday some of us die due in part to 1,000 paper cuts, though it's written up in the newspaper as suicide. That's it for this time. Next time, part 12, or rape culture.